Most folks think a wedding marks a new beginning. In the blistering, hell-charred summer of 1874 in a godforsaken corner of Wichita, it marked the end of the world. While inspired by the spirit of the American frontier, the story you're about to hear is a work of historical fiction created for storytelling and entertainment. I remember that day like it was branded into my retinas with a white-hot iron. The Kansas heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on the small wooden chapel near the Arkansas River. The dust clung to every face before the ceremony had even begun. Sarah was standing at the altar. She had no idea she had less than 1 minute left to be a bride. She wore a white dress that looked far too pure for a place this jagged. She was 22 years old. Her blue eyes still carried hope. Beside her stood Elias Thorne. Nobody inside that chapel knew the groom had already noticed several strangers watching from across the street. He was a man who carried more jagged scars on his back than coins in his weathered pockets. Elias was 40, maybe 45. His hands knew the cold, heavy weight of a Remington better than the warmth of a woman's tut. Folks simply called him a drifter. Nobody asked where he'd come from. Nobody asked twice, but he had promised to protect her. He had sworn a blood oath before the law and before the Almighty that no harm would ever reach her. The preacher was just getting to the good part about death do us part. Then, the heavy doors of the chapel burst open. The sound was like a sudden thunderclap in a room full of panicked whispers. Dust swirled inward. It was thick and suffocating. 6 men stood in the doorway. Their silhouettes were dark and predatory against the blinding afternoon sun. They were not wedding guests. They were wolves dressed in denim and worn leather. Leading them was a man named Baron Vance Sterling. Sterling was the most powerful man in the county. He was a cattle king. He owned the land. He owned the railroad. He even owned the local sheriff's badge. He did not simply walk into the chapel. He invaded it. He looked at Sarah like she was high-grade livestock he had forgotten to bid on at auction. "I told you, girl," Sterling said. His voice was a low, oily rumble that made my skin crawl. "Nothing in this godforsaken town happens without my personal blessing." Elias stepped forward. His hand rested easy and loose near the walnut grip of the Colt at his hip. He did not reach for the gun yet. A man who draws too fast is often a man who dies too soon. "This is a house of God, Sterling," Elias said. His voice was raspy. It sounded like heavy gravel being dragged across a dry, sun-baked board. "Take your curs and ride back to the filth you came from," Sterling laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. It lacked any trace of human humor. He motioned to his thugs. These were men hired for their total lack of conscience. They were hired for their steady, murderous hands. Before anyone could blink, the chapel was full of the metallic click of cocking hammers. Nobody inside reached for a weapon. Everyone knew drawing first meant dying first. 2 men grabbed Sarah by the arms. She did not scream. She was a Miller. Millers did not give those bastards the satisfaction of seeing their fear, but her fingers clawed at the air. They told the real story of her terror. Elias felt the air in the room turn electric. It felt the way it does right before a lightning strike on the open plain. He knew he could kill 3 of them before the first bullet hit his chest, but Sarah would be caught in the lethal crossfire. Waiting was harder than dying. He had to wait. He had to endure. He watched as they dragged his bride out of the church. They dragged her into the choking dust of the street. Sterling leaned close to Elias. The smell of expensive tobacco and cheap cruelty wafted off him. "I own the law. I own the land. And now I own her," Sterling hissed. They threw her onto a horse. They thundered away toward the north. Elias stood alone in the center of the chapel. The silence followed the hoofbeats like a heavy, suffocating shroud. He looked at the preacher. The man was trembling so hard his Bible hit the floor with a dull thud. He looked at the empty pews. He looked at the spilled communion wine on the floor. It looked far too much like fresh blood. Then he looked at his hands. They were not shaking. They were steady. They were rooted in a cold, hard, and murderous certainty. He walked out of the chapel. He moved toward his buckskin gelding. The horse was lean and scarred. It was an animal that had survived the same long, brutal miles as its master. Elias checked his leather saddlebags. He checked the load in his cylinders. He checked the razor edge of the Bowie knife tucked into his boot. He was no longer a groom. He was a hunter. Wichita was a town built on the bleach-white bones of the Chisholm Trail. It was a place where life was cheap. It was a place where whiskey was expensive. The year 1874 was a hard one for the territory. The panic of 1873 had left the banks empty. It had left the people desperate and hungry. To make matters worse, the great locust plague was descending. Millions of grasshoppers were darkening the sky. They were eating the very clothes off people's backs. In times like those, men like Sterling grew fat on the misery of others. Elias rode through the muddy street. His eyes were narrow and focused. He did not look at the crowded saloons. He ignored the gambling halls of Hell's Half Acre. He looked for tracks in the dirt. Then he spotted something caught on a thorn bush, a torn piece of Sarah's wedding veil. She was leaving him a trail. Sterling had a ranch north of town. It was a fortress built with blood money and stolen deeds. Elias pushed his horse into a steady to rhythmic gallop. He knew the Kansas prairie like a man knows his own reflection. He knew every hidden coulee. He knew every dry creek bed. He knew every patch of scrub brush. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the sky turned the color of a fresh wound. The light was orange and deep red. It cast long, bloody shadows across the tall, yellow grass. He reached the ridge overlooking Sterling's valley. The first stars began to poke through the velvet blue. He could see the ranch house. It was a grand structure. It looked entirely out of place in the wild, untamed land. Lanterns glowed in the windows. They looked like the eyes of a hungry, waiting beast. Elias dismounted. He led his horse into the deep shadows of a cedar grove. He sat in the tall grass. He waited. Patience is the greatest weapon a gunslinger possesses. He remembered his oath. I swore I'd protect her, he whispered to the biting wind. The wind did not answer. It only carried the distant sound of men laughing. It carried a woman's defiant, agonizing silence. He took a long pull from his canteen. The water was warm. It tasted of tin and desperation. Then he drew his Colt. The cold metal was familiar in his palm. It was an extension of his own arm. He was going to kill them all. He was going to burn Sterling's entire world to the ground. But he had to be smart. He was one man against 10, maybe 20. He needed the darkness, that he needed the fear that lives in the hearts of men who know they are doing wrong. He began to move, low and slow, a shadow among shadows. He reached the perimeter fence. The wood was dry and splintered. He saw a guard leaning against a post. The rifle was held loosely in the boy's arms. The guard was young, maybe 19. His face had not yet been hardened by enough sin. Elias felt a fleeting moment of pity, but he pushed it down deep. Pity gets a man buried in Kansas. He moved behind the guard. His footsteps were silent on the soft, dry earth. He did not use his gun. He used the heavy steel barrel to strike the boy behind the ear. The guard went down without a single sound. His rifle fell softly into the grass. Elias took the rifle. He moved toward the main house. He could hear voices now. Sterling was talking. His tone was arrogant. It was demanding. Where are the deeds? Sarah, Sterling shouted. Elias froze in the shadows. Deeds. He realized then that this wasn't just about a beautiful woman. It was about the Miller land. It was a tract of territory that controlled the only year-round water source in the county. In 1874, water was more valuable than gold. Without water, the cattle died. Without water, the town died. Sarah's father had died 2 months ago. They called it a mining accident. It smelled of sabotage, it smelled of Sterling. She had inherited the land. Sterling wanted it to complete his empire. Elias felt a cold, jagged rage settle in his gut. This was the way of the West. It was a place where the strong devoured the weak. That is, until someone stood in the way. He reached the side of the house. His back was pressed against the rough-hewn logs. He peered through a grime-streaked window. He saw them. Sarah was tied to a chair in the center of a grand dining room. Sterling was standing over her. His silk vest was stained with sweat and stolen wine. His thugs were scattered around the room. Their weapons were close at hand. One of them had a jagged scar across his nose. He stepped toward Sarah. He reached out to touch her hair. A leering, disgusting grin was on his face. Elias did not wait any longer. He stood up. His silhouette was framed by the lantern light behind him. He drew his Colt so fast that nobody in the room remembered seeing his hand move. "I swore I'd protect her," Elias roared. His voice echoed through the house like a heavy cannon blast. The thugs dared to touch his bride. That was the last mistake they would ever make. The first shot took the man with the scars straight through the chest. He was dead before he hit the polished floorboard. The room erupted into total chaos. Glass shattered into 1,000 diamonds. Elias dived through the window. He rolled across the floor. He came up firing with surgical precision. He did not aim for the body. He aimed for the soul. Another thug tried to raise a shotgun. Elias was faster. The lead caught the man in the shoulder. It spun him around like a top. His buckshot went harmlessly into the ceiling. Sterling dived behind a heavy oak table. His face was a mask of sudden, sharp terror. He realized then that Elias was not just a drifter. He was a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. He was a man who had decided he liked the scenery there. Elias moved behind a leather armchair. The bullets from the remaining thugs shredded the upholstery. Cotton stuffing flew through the air like snow in a Kansas winter. "Untie her," Elias shouted. His voice cut through the deafening roar of the gunshots. He fired twice more. He pinned a guard behind a heavy doorway. Sarah was struggling against her ropes. Her eyes were fixed on Elias. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked like she was waiting for him to finish the job. Elias saw a kerosene lamp hanging above the dining table. He took a deep breath. He steadied his hand. He pulled the trigger. The lamp exploded in a magnificent ball of orange fire. Burning oil rained down on the tablecloth, and it soaked into the expensive rug. Thick, black smoke began to fill the room. It stung eyes. It choked lungs. In the confusion, Elias moved. He reached Sarah's side in 3 long, predatory strides. He used his Bowie knife. He slashed through the thick hemp rope. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but her spirit was unbroken. "They're only copies," Sarah whispered. "Father made me hide the real deeds 3 days before the wedding. Sterling's been chasing a lie all evening." Her voice was urgent. "Sterling won't let us leave this house alive." Elias grabbed her hand. His grip was firm. It was grounding. "He doesn't have a choice," Elias replied. They moved toward the back of the house. The flames were licking at the walls behind them. The heat was intense. It was a reminder of the hell Sterling had built for himself. They burst through the back door. They stepped into the cool night air, but they were not alone. 3 more of Sterling's men were waiting for them. They were positioned near the stables. They were armed with Winchesters. The barrels glinted coldly in the moonlight. Elias pushed Sarah behind a heavy water trough. "Stay down," he commanded. He stood in the open. His poncho fluttered in the midnight wind. He looked like a figure from an old, bloody legend. He was a nameless gunslinger standing against the dark. The men fired. The bullets kicked up plumes of dirt around his boots. Elias did not flinch. He did not blink. He raised his Colt. He fired 3 times. His movements were rhythmic. They were lethal. 1 man fell. 2 men turned and ran into the darkness. Cowards always run when the light of truth gets too bright. Elias turned to Sarah. He helped her up. "We need the horses," he said. They reached the stable. They found their mounts. As they rode out of the yard, Elias looked back. The ranch house was a pillar of fire now. It was a funeral pyre for Sterling's hollow ambition. But he knew the Baron was still alive. A man like that doesn't die easily. He's like a weed that survives the longest drought. He only lives to choke the life out of the garden. They rode south. They moved away from the flames. They moved toward the river. The prairie was silent. The stars watched over them with cold, crystalline indifference. Elias felt the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. He had saved her, but the war was far from over. Sterling still had the law on his side. He still had the money. He had the influence to turn the whole state against them. But Elias didn't care about the state. He cared about the woman riding beside him. He had sworn an oath. And an oath is the only thing a man truly owns in this world. Now, listen close, friend. This is where the story gets real. If you're still riding this trail with me, you're exactly the kind of person I enjoy telling these stories to. Subscribe if old Western tales still mean something to you. Now let's get back to Elias. They rode until the horses could no longer keep the pace. They found a shallow cave near the riverbank. It was hidden by a thick curtain of willow trees. Elias built a small fire. He kept it low. He didn't want the light to give them away. He sat near the entrance. His eyes were focused on the dark, treacherous horizon. Sarah sat across from him. Her white wedding dress was now gray with ash when it was stained with dust. She looked at her wrist. The iron chain had left a red, raw mark. "He won't stop, Elias," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "He will hunt us until the end of the earth." Elias did not look back at her. "Let him come," he said. "The earth is a big place, and I know the hidden corners better than he ever will." He reached into his coat. He pulled out a small tin of salve. He walked over to her. He began to rub it onto her bruised, damaged skin. His hands were rough. They were calloused, but his touch was as gentle as a summer breeze. "I'm sorry," Elias whispered. Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were shining in the dying firelight. "For what?" she asked. "For not being fast enough at the chapel." Sarah reached out. She touched his face. Her fingers traced the hard line of his jaw. "You came for me," she said. "That is all that matters." They sat in silence for a long time. The sound of the river flowed past them. It sounded like the relentless passage of time. Elias thought about his life. He thought about the years of blood and dust. He had been a soldier in a war that had no winners. He had seen the horrors of the Civil War. He had seen men die for lines on a map. He had been a lawman in towns that didn't want the law. He had been a ghost for so long. He had forgotten what it was like to be a man, but Sarah had given him a name again. She had given him a reason to stand tall. As the fire began to die down to glowing embers, Elias felt a shift. The wind had changed direction. It carried the smell of rain. It carried the distant, rhythmic sound of many horses. Sterling had not waited for the morning. He had gathered a posse. It was a group of men interested in the reward. They didn't care about the truth. Elias stood up. His hand hovered near his colt. "Get on your horse, Sarah," he commanded. "We have to move." They rode into the teeth of the coming storm. The clouds were thick and black. They swallowed the moon and the stars whole. Thunder rolled across the prairie. So it sounded like the drums of an approaching war. The rain began to fall. It was a cold, hard drenching. It turned the Kansas dust into thick, sucking mud. They reached the crossing of the Arkansas River. The lightning began to flash. The water was high and rising fast. It was a churning mass of angry gray foam. Elias saw the posse on the ridge behind them. Their torches flickered weakly in the rain. There were at least 20 of them. "We have to cross," Elias shouted over the howling wind. Sarah did not hesitate. She pushed her horse into the dangerous current. The horse slipped. For one terrifying second, she disappeared beneath the dark water. Elias caught the reins just in time. The animal struggled to keep its footing on the rocks. Elias followed her. His eyes were fixed on the far bank. Halfway across, a shot rang out. The bullet hissed into the water. It missed Elias's head by mere inches. Sterling was at the riverbank now. His face was contorted with a demonic rage. "Kill him!" Sterling screamed. "Kill them both!" Elias turned in his saddle. He fired back. But the driving rain made it impossible to aim. He pushed his horse harder. The water reached the animal's chest. They scrambled onto the southern bank. The mud was slick and treacherous. Elias looked back. He saw the posse hesitating at the water's edge. Even desperate men fear a rising river in the middle of the night. "Keep moving," Elias shouted. They rode through the night. The rain washed the blood and the ash from their clothes. By dawn, the storm had passed. It left the world sparkling and new. They reached a remote plateau. It was a place known as the Devil's Pulpit. It was a high, rocky outcrop. It overlooked the entire valley. In the center of the plateau sat an abandoned mission. Its stone walls were crumbling under the weight of the years. This is the place of the final stand. Elias stood on the edge of the cliff. His poncho was draped over his broad shoulders. He looked back at the trail they had left behind. He knew Sterling was coming. He knew this was the place where it would all end. He walked into the mission. He found Sarah. She was standing near the broken altar. The morning light streamed through the shattered roof. She held a small iron key in her hand. It was the key to the satchel. "If anything happens to me, Elias," she said, "take the deeds to the federal marshal in Topeka." Elias walked over to her. He took her hands in his. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. "I swore a blood oath." He walked out to the front of the mission. He began to prepare for battle. He moved heavy stone. He created a breastwork. He checked the ammunition in his rifle. He looked at the sky. It was a clear, brilliant blue. It was a beautiful day for a fight. Sterling arrived an hour later. He didn't come with a full posse this time. He came with 4 of his best men. These were the ones who didn't run. They rode up the narrow path to the mission. Their horses were breathing hard and fast. Sterling stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at Elias. For the first time, he saw the man clearly. He saw the former cavalryman. He saw the protector. He saw the man who had nothing left to lose but his soul. "Give her to me, Elias," Sterling called out, "and I'll let you walk away with your life." Elias stood behind the stone wall. His rifle was steady as a rock. "You already took my life, Sterling," Elias replied. "Years ago, when you burned my family's farm in Missouri." The silence that followed was heavy. It carried the weight of 20 years of ghosts. Sterling flinched. He didn't remember the farm. He had burned so many in his climb to power. But Elias remembered every flame. He had spent 20 years waiting for this exact moment. He had been the drifter. He had been the nameless man. He was searching for the face that had ruined his existence, and he had found it. He had found it in a dusty chapel in Wichita. This wasn't just about the Miller land anymore. It was about justice. It was 20 years overdue. "Kill him," Sterling whispered to his men. The 4 men moved forward. Their guns were blaring. Elias answered with the roar of his Winchester. The first man fell instantly. His horse bolted into the thick brush. The second man dived behind a rock. But Elias was a master of the terrain. He fired a shot that ricocheted off the stone. It hit the man in the leg. Sterling pulled his own revolver. He fired wild. His hand was shaking with cowardice. "You're an old man." "Elias," Sterling shouted, "you can't win against me." Elias did not answer with words. He moved from cover to cover. His movements were fluid. They were practiced. He was a shadow. He was a ghost. He was a force of nature. He reached the side of the mission. The third man tried to enter. Elias dropped the rifle. He drew his Colt. The sound was like a heavy hammer hitting an anvil. The man fell into the dirt. Now it was only Sterling and his final bodyguard. The bodyguard was a man named Rance. He was a professional killer from the Lincoln County War. Rance was fast, but Rance was also smart. He saw Elias. He waited for the perfect shot. Elias stepped out from behind the stone pillar. The 2 men stood 20 paces apart. The Kansas sun beat down on them. Rance reached for his gun. He was fast, but Elias was certain. The shot rang out. It was a single sharp note in the quiet morning. Rance looked down at his chest. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He fell backward. The red stain spread across his white shirt. Now Elias turned to Sterling. The cattle king was alone now. His silk vest was torn. His pride was broken. He fell to his knees in the dirt. His revolver lay out of reach. "Please, Elias," Sterling begged. Sarah stepped forward. Her eyes never left Sterling. "Did you show my father that same mercy?" she asked. "I have money. I can give you anything you want." Then, with one desperate motion, Sterling reached for the revolver hidden beneath his coat. Elias stopped instantly, his Colt already trained on Sterling's chest. Sterling slowly froze. Only then did Elias step forward. His boots crunched on the gravel. He stood over the man who had caused so much misery. He looked at Sarah. She was standing in the doorway of the mission. She looked at the man who had kidnapped her. She looked at the man who tried to steal her life. What do we do with him? Sarah, Elias asked. Sarah walked forward. Her face was calm. It was resolute. We don't do anything, she said. We let the law handle him. Elias looked at her. He understood her wisdom. If he killed Sterling in cold blood, he would be no better than the man in the dirt. He would be the ghost again. He holstered his gun. Tie him up, Elias said. They took Sterling back to Wichita. He didn't return as a king. He returned as a prisoner in chains. The federal marshal was waiting. The deeds and the account books were all the evidence they needed. The town of Wichita changed after that day. The reign of the cattle kings began to fade. It was replaced by the law. It was replaced by the grit of honest people. Elias and Sarah went back to the Miller Ranch. They rebuilt the house. They mended the broken fences. They stayed on the land. It was land bought with blood and defended with honor. Elias Thorne was no longer the nameless gunslinger. He was a husband. He was a rancher. He was a man who had kept his sacred word every year on their anniversary. They went back to the mission. They stood on the edge of the cliff at the Devil's Pulpit. They looked out over the vast, beautiful land. They remembered the fire. They remembered the rain. They remembered the man in the white silk vest. They remembered the oath. I swore I'd protect her, Elias would say. Sarah would take his hand and smile. And you did, Elias. You always did. Now, listen to me one last time, partner. This story shows us something vital. No matter how dark the night gets, a man with a steady heart can find his way home. It reminds us that courage isn't about being faster than the next man. It's about being more certain of what you stand for. If this story moved you, if it gave you a bit of fire for your own battles, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit the bell so you never miss a trail we ride together, and tell me, what did you think of Elias's choice at the end? Should he have pulled the trigger, or was Sarah right to let the law have him? I read every single comment. I want to hear from the folks who still appreciate the old ways. In the next video, we're going to look at a legend from the Texas Panhandle. It's a story about a lawman who had to choose between his badge and his own brother. You won't want to miss that one. Until the next time the sun sets over the prairie. Take care of yourself. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Keep your hands steady. We'll see you on the next trail. Stay strong. Friends, stay true to your word. The West is full of stories, and we've only just begun to tell them. Good night, and God bless.